"We need to talk," said my girlfriend, visiting me in Charlottesville. "Uh-oh," I thought. "You're stuck," she says. "Stuck, stuck, stuck. Ever since the weather turned cold, you've been pacing around like a wild animal. The clutch on your Volkswagen is slipping from the oil leak so bad you can't come see me because your car won't go over the mountain. You can't drop the engine to fix it because it's too cold outside. And," she says, "you can't afford to get a shop to fix your car, so here's the solution to all your problems. Go south. You had a great time last season in the Florida Keys, and you made money playing music in Key West. There are no mountains between here and Florida, so you'll probably make it okay. And if you only go for a month, I won't mind, I promise." "My gracious," says I, "go south like the birds and be warm." But actually my town is in a valley, and a local hill, which Thomas Jefferson named Pantops Mountain, is between me and Florida. It looms all of 223 feet above the Rivanna River. I try to tighten the 3 bolts holding down the oil cooler, but I can hardly reach them back in the engine. My hands are freezing, and I run into the house every 5 minutes to drink hot tea and warm up. I really need to drop and remove the engine from the car to replace the 2 little rubber gaskets that seal the oil leaks, but it's just too cold. So I pack the car up, and as my overloaded VW approaches the hill, headed east, I hear the clutch start to slip and the car slows down. I pull into the gravel breakdown lane to avoid holding up traffic, but I keep rolling along in second gear. Bumping along the side of the road, I keep moving, trying not to lose momentum. A friend waves and honks as he passes me on the 4-lane. At about 20 miles an hour, I crest the hill, and starting down, pull into the regular traffic lane and slowly get up to speed. On level ground, as long as I accelerate very slowly, I can keep the clutch from slipping and make progress to the south. That is literally the only hill that I encounter for the next 3 days. My spirits lift, and I figure as long as I keep pouring in oil, I should make it. I have on board a case of oil, a new clutch, and to fix the leak, 2 little rubber gaskets for the oil cooler that cost $1.27. I had a little problem the next morning, starting out. At my brother's house in coastal North Carolina, he loans me his miniature sailboat, and we lash it on top of the car. But the additional wind resistance is just too much. The wind is blowing stiffly from the south, and on the highway I'm unable to get up speed before the clutch slips. This happens over and over until I get an idea. Like a good sailor, I tack the boat and car combo to a road heading west, sideways to the wind, and lo and behold, the car gets up to highway speed. Once I'm inland about 20 miles, the wind calms down, and I make it up the ramp to Interstate 95, proceeding directly south and almost going the speed limit. After 2 long days driving, I bump down the dirt coast road on Boca Chica Key, past the Air Force runway, and park at the dead end. A trail leads to the Mangrove Forest campground, where a small community of tents is camped in little openings along the beach. I propose to make this my home and vehicle repair shop, and walking in, I see and say hello to a friend from last season. "Hey, Richard," I call out, "how's it going?" We walk around the campsite, saying hello to everyone with the warm breeze rustling in shade trees, lapping of small waves on the beach, guitars playing, and campfires cooking. There are no bugs or snakes, but there are palmetto bugs as big as your hand, which sometimes scuttle into the bushes. At night, various critters come out, like the hermit crabs and, of course, a family of raccoons. As long as you keep your food in your car, the wildlife gives you no problems. A nice campsite close to the road provides a sand ramp down to the water, where I can back my car hanging over the edge a few feet from the surf. My plan is to excavate a trench in the sand directly under the engine, remove the 4 bolts, and slowly lower the engine out of the car without having to use jacks at all. This idea comes from a wonderful book called How to Keep Your Volkswagen Alive, although I've never tried it. In fact, everything I know about mechanicking comes from this book, including the idea that the oil leak is a result of the loose oil cooler. We shall see. After setting up my tent, gathering wood, and cooking dinner, I throw a little welcoming party for myself as the sun sets and all my new friends gather around. It's like a happy gypsy camp with lots of singing. Here I can play the gracious host, pouring out wine and enjoying the joyful babble. Since I have some savings and I own a car, here I'm a solid citizen. At home, I'm just a poor hippie because I only have an old Volkswagen Bug. Next day, with my trusty book, I prepare to remove an engine for the first time. I'm just 10 feet from the ocean, but there are never any waves because the Florida Keys are protected by a shallow reef 4 miles wide. Using an Army entrenchment shovel to dig into the embankment, I remove enough sand for a deep trench between the rear tires. With a piece of plywood in the bottom, it looks like I have enough clearance to get the engine out and slide it back to work on it. Richard extends my car jack underneath as the 4 bolts loosen, and soon he's balancing the 200 greasy pounds above him. Turning the jack handle and with some shoving and clanking, we lower the engine to the plywood. What a triumph! So far only 1 wrench has dropped into the sand and disappeared. Now we take a break, cover the engine up, and read the manual for the next step. Because we're covered in grease and sand, we have a big bucket hoisted up on a tree limb. Our friends say that Lemon Joy dish soap works great with salt water. We find it takes a lot of soap to get clean, and for the next several days, we exude that smell aromatically. Richard and I decided to form a band for the street music sunset celebration in Key West, and in our off hours work up tunes and songs under the shade trees. Each day we get greasy for a few hours before joining the crowd on the beach. Checking off each step in the book, we can finally click the jack lever from down to up and slowly raise the hopefully fixed and functional 200 pounds of metal back up where it belongs. There are only about 6 hoses and wires to hook up, and then the big moment comes. I turn the key and it starts. It actually chugs down the road okay for a short test run. We have a big party with Key West beckoning. The next afternoon, we roll 15 miles down the Keys to the end of Route 1, Mallory Square in Old Key West. As Richard and I set up our instruments backing up to the water view, amidst a crowd of tourists, who should walk up but our old friend from last season, Gary the Fiddler. He says, "Hi guys, let's play some tunes." With the guitar case in front of us, I say, "Key of D, boys," and hit a square dance tune hard and fast. Between my dulcimer and Gary's fiddling, we draw a nice crowd and have a wonderful time. We even make a few bucks, which we use afterwards for dinner and drinks. I call home to talk to my girlfriend, and I have to say that she sounds a little huffy about my tales of living on the beach. "You do remember it's winter up here," she says. Richard and I carry our instruments back to the car, but Richard says, "Uh-oh," and points to a small pool of fresh oil under the engine. It seems that all that work on the beach was in vain. Richard says, "Let's go see Ricky. He owns a speed shop, and he only works on VWs." And sure enough, Ricky's shop has dismantled bugs spread all across the floor. I never knew that they raced bugs on sand racetracks all over Florida. Ricky listens to our story, looks under the car, and says all we have to do is tighten all the bolts holding the jugs on, whatever they are, and install new gaskets. He explains that the 4 engine cylinders are separate parts, and mine are loose on the engine block, and he hands over the 4 gaskets we will need. "Well," says Richard, "we still have a nice trench dug into the sand back at Boca Chica," and we head home up the Keys. We don't even have to stop for any other car parts. Next day, the familiar 3-day drill repeats itself. Disconnect and drop the engine. Clean up with that fragrant Lemon Joy. Next day, rebolt the cylinders and valve covers with new gaskets. Clean up with more Lemon Joy. Next day, reinstall the engine. Haul more buckets of ocean water for more dish soap scrubbing. This time, we don't lose any tools in the sand, and the car jumps down the road like a rabbit. I guess the engine compression was low due to all the loose bolts because now it has a lot more power. And the next morning there's no oil under the engine either. Maybe we got this thing licked, says Richard. Now we really need a day off. And my friend Walter and his girlfriend suggest that I take him out on my little sailboat so he can catch fish. Walter is a short warrior sort of a guy who fishes by wading in the shallows with a spear that he made himself out of a tree limb. He has regularly supplied us with fish in exchange for beer. So I make an anchor, and Walter and I sail a little ways offshore, and he slips off the boat. I lower the sail and sit watching him dive in the clear water. After a while, his spear pokes out of the water with a foot-long impaled fish. Walter stays in the water and says, "Grab it," and immediately dives again. He gets enough fish to invite everyone to a beach luau. So now, instead of working on the engine every day, I take Walter out fishing instead. Once he speared a sawfish, which has a murderous 1-foot serrated nose. I say to him, "Walter, we can't eat this. Why did you kill it?" Walter just smiles, because it's there. One night, we're sitting around the campfire, and a friend sidles up and very quietly says, "There are bales of dope washing ashore down by the parking lot." With our flashlights, we slink through the campsite, and as we reach the road, a car suddenly scratches out of the parking lot and away. Other campers are walking up and down the beach searching. We can see past the surf. There are several boats with searchlights slowly traveling back and forth. The guys on the beach say that several bales have been recovered, and there are broken-up pieces floating in right now. I look down in the water, and I see a lump about the size of a cantaloupe bobbing in the waves. When I pick it up and smell it, I realize what it is. Without saying a word, I turn around and walk back to camp. The marijuana has been dried and compressed into bales, and for some reason thrown into the water. The clump that I found was the corner of a bale, and it's only wet on the outside. I break it all up and spread it out in my tent, hoping that it'll dry a little bit. I hear a couple of other cars tear out of the parking lot. But after that, all is quiet, and I don't think anybody finds any more. There's wild speculation around the campfires, but we assume that smugglers were interrupted by the Coast Guard and threw their cargo overboard. Supposedly, the Coast Guard won't board a suspicious vessel at night for safety reasons, but if it won't stop, they just follow it till daylight. In the meantime, all the cargo is thrown overboard and the boats are cleaned up as much as possible. I gather up what I've got and bury it underneath my tent in an old gallon pickle jar. The next day, we all act normal. Me and Walter go out fishing. But somehow the word gets out, and rough-looking guys show up in the afternoon asking us what we know about all this. But we play innocent. A few people from town show up, and after walking up and down the beach, sit down in the seagrass that is piled up at the edge of the water and start picking through it. They can recover about an ounce of dope if they sit there for an hour. That night, we have one heck of a party on the beach, all clustered together nervously because every now and then another batch floats in and a group of unknown people run through the dark, get in a car, and take off for town. We're all getting a little stressed compared to our regular campground life. Walter is drinking pretty heavy, but his girlfriend is taking care of him. But the next morning, she shows up very concerned after finding him passed out on the beach. When we wake him up, he says he has no feeling in his swollen right arm. Looking at it, we see 2 little purple pinpricks, and someone says that might be a scorpion bite. She drives him off to the hospital, and I say to Richard, this is getting a little weird for me, and I'm overdue to go home, so I'm packing up. I throw my tent into the car and dig up the pickle jar. As I drive down the highway, I pass a police car going in. Swinging onto Route 1 North, I hear a faint tapping in the engine that's new. That's funny, because the engine is not leaking oil at all anymore, and in fact it's cruising along better than ever. For the next half an hour, the tapping becomes more of a banging sound. When I stop the car, the banging stops, unless I rev the engine, and then the bangs are even worse. Hoping for the best, I swing onto the 7-mile bridge, which has no turnarounds or shoulders except one in the middle for Pigeon Key. By the time I get to the end of the 7-mile bridge, I'm making quite a racket. But amazingly, there is a Volkswagen repair shop right at the north end of the bridge. As I pull into the parking lot, the mechanic comes out of the open bay door and says to me, "My boy, you have thrown a rod." I tell him my story and ask him what is throwing a rod. He says that the increased compression from tightening all the bolts has strained the crankshaft to the point that one of the bearings has disintegrated. Well, can I make it back to Key West? He laughs. That's the 7-mile bridge. If you break down on that, after a while I'll see traffic backed up way past my shop. I drive back onto the 7-mile bridge. What else can I do? I have friends in a campsite 37 miles from here. An hour later, I pull back into my old camping spot, loudly going bang, 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 and I back the car back over the trench, thinking I'm going to change the engine again. I feel a little deflated, but I'm happy to make it back. I've only been gone for 3 hours. Back in Key West at the VW Speed Shop, Ricky says, "You just can't win for losing, can you?" But he also says he has just finished rebuilding a racing engine that I can have for $600 if I trade in my old engine. I can even keep and reuse my fancy Bosch distributor, my pride and joy. No problem fitting it in the car, he says, and in fact, he has bored out the cylinders and installed larger pistons, so this engine is an 1800cc, giving all of 62 horsepower. When I return my old engine block to Ricky, pay in cash and pick up the new one of his mechanics wanders over to see what's going on. When he hears I paid $600, he says, "Man, Ricky, you're letting the good ones go cheap." Back at the campground, Richard and I prepare to install the new engine while all around us the marijuana drama continues. Occasionally, dope washes in. Big fellows come around asking a lot of questions to us dumb guys who don't know anything. The pickers still sit in the surf all day long separating the seaweed for an ounce or two. There is now an industry in town where they take your salt dope, wash it in fresh water, and then spread it out to dry in their attic. They take 1/10 of the weight as payment. Boats are still cruising up and down way off the beach. I pay Richard to help me because I don't want to go down to town to make money. My phone calls to my girlfriend have gotten pretty tense. Somehow or another, I just don't seem to be able to get home. I found out a year or so later from her that actually I waited a little too long, but all is now forgiven. After very patiently installing an engine on the same beach for the 3rd time in 2 weeks, which goes okay, Richard and I take our last shower in Lemon Joy saltwater. That afternoon, we see Coast Guard boats out on the ocean. After a while, black smoke starts to rise all across the horizon. People say that when bales are found floating in the water, they're soaked in diesel and burned. That night, the ocean to the east is a sea of flame, like the apocalypse. Once again, I pack up to go home. This time, I make it over the 7-mile bridge. In fact, I make it to my friends in Georgia. Next day, I make it to my brother's in North Carolina and return his sailboat. I call my girlfriend, who sounds dubious. At least it's March and the weather is getting warmer. Next day, after 6 hours roaring down the interstate and a half an hour from home, the engine suddenly dies completely. A quick check shows that the points on my old but prized Bosch distributor have shattered, and I do not have a spare set. I start the long walk uphill to the next exit and another humiliating call to my girlfriend. But I'm home at last.